3 gunshots. Gate 9 erupted. A black man in a gray hoodie collapsed, silent hands visible, no resistance. 10 minutes later, every screen in the terminal flashed emergency protocol activated. The new owner of the security system stepped forward. And it was the same man they'd just shot. This isn't a revenge story, this is a masterclass in how to change an entire system with brains and a checkbook. Drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from, and smash that subscribe button for Black Stories box, because today's justice comes with both strategy and serious money. I'm telling you this story because sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't anger, it's preparation. What I witnessed at Denver International Airport that Tuesday morning proves that when you combine patience, resources, and unshakable determination, you can flip an entire system on its head. My name is Jonathan Pierce, and I've been a security consultant for 15 years, but nothing in my experience prepared me for what I was about to witness. This story starts with a quarter and ends with a revolution that changed American airport security forever. But first, let me take you back to the moment when everything changed, because the details matter, and every detail in this story was planned with surgical precision. The morning started deceptively normal, with that familiar airport chaos that masks deeper currents of tension and inequality. I was in Terminal B at Denver International, grabbing my usual black coffee before a consulting flight to Portland, when I noticed the dangerous energy building at Security Checkpoint 3. The fluorescent lights cast their harsh glare over the familiar scene of travelers removing shoes and laptops, but something felt different today. A tall black man in his early 40s stood calmly in the TSA pre-check line, wearing a simple gray hoodie and dark jeans that looked expensive but understated. Nothing flashy, nothing that should have drawn unwanted attention from security personnel. But Officer Brett Morrison's pale blue eyes had locked onto him with the kind of predatory focus that makes my consultant's instincts scream warnings. I recognized that look immediately from my years studying security protocols and human behavior patterns. Growing up in Birmingham in the 80s, I'd seen that exact expression countless times. That cold calculation that decides someone is guilty before they've done anything wrong. That systematic dehumanization that transforms a person into a potential threat based solely on melanin concentration. The man, who I'd later learn was identified as Xavier Blake, moved through the security process with quiet dignity that spoke of extensive travel experience. His movements were deliberate, respectful, almost choreographed in their careful compliance with every spoken and unspoken rule. When the metal detector beeped its electronic warning, Xavier stepped aside without being asked, removing his leather dress shoes and placing them carefully in the gray plastic bins alongside his laptop bag and jacket. His movements suggested someone accustomed to this ritual, someone who'd learned to navigate these spaces with the extra caution that black men develop as survival mechanism. But Morrison wasn't satisfied with standard compliance. He circled Xavier like a predator, sizing up prey, his voice escalating with each interaction, each question designed to provoke rather than clarify. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't make any sudden movements. What's in your pockets? Why are you acting so nervous? Where are you traveling today? What's the purpose of your trip?" The questions came rapid fire, each one delivered with increasing aggression, as if Xavier's calm, measured responses were somehow evidence of deception rather than cooperation. Xavier's responses were masterful in their de-escalation technique, polite but not deferential, clear but not defensive. "Yes, sir. Nothing in my pockets, sir. I'm not nervous, just trying to follow your instructions carefully. I'm traveling to Seattle for business meetings. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have." But somehow his very compliance seemed to make Morrison more aggressive, more determined to find justification for his obvious suspicion. It was as if Xavier's refusal to be intimidated was itself suspicious, as if his articulate responses triggered some deep-seated bias that demanded submission rather than cooperation. That's when I noticed something extraordinary that would change everything. Elena Rodriguez, a young Latina TSA agent positioned at the document verification station, had quietly angled herself to get a clear view of the escalating interaction. Her hand rested casually on her smartwatch, but I caught the subtle movement of her finger. She was recording everything. Later, I'd learned that Elena had been documenting Morrison's pattern of discriminatory behavior for weeks, waiting for the right moment to expose what everyone knew but no one would officially acknowledge. Morrison's search became increasingly invasive and humiliating, performed with theatrical aggression designed to demonstrate power rather than ensure security. He made Xavier remove his belt twice, empty his expensive leather backpack completely onto the metal table, and submit to an additional full-body pat-down that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Other passengers grew visibly uncomfortable, sensing the racial dynamic, but afraid to intervene in what appeared to be official security business. The entire checkpoint slowed to watch this theater of systematic humiliation, this daily reminder of who belongs and who must prove they belong. Children stared with wide eyes as their parents pulled them closer, teaching them through observation that some people are more suspect than others, that authority can be arbitrary and cruel. Elderly travelers shook their heads, but said nothing, their silence complicit in maintaining a system they privately knew was wrong. Business travelers checked their phones and avoided eye contact, prioritizing their own convenience over another human being's dignity. Then Morrison found a coin that had slipped through a small tear in the fabric lining of Xavier's left shoe. A single quarter probably dropped during a previous flight and forgotten that must have shifted into the leather during his walk through the terminal. 25 cents of American currency that would trigger a cascade of events. None of us could have predicted a perfect demonstration of how small pretexts can justify enormous violations of human dignity. "He's concealing metal objects," Morrison shouted into his radio with theatrical alarm, his voice carrying across the terminal and causing heads to turn throughout the security area. "Potential weapon concealment detected, request immediate backup for suspicious individual." 3 additional officers responded within seconds, surrounding Xavier with hands resting on their weapons, creating a circle of official menace around a man whose only crime was carrying loose change and imperfect footwear. Xavier remained perfectly still, his hands raised at shoulder height in the universal gesture of surrender, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around him like a storm made of badges and fear. "Sir, it's just loose change. A quarter that must have fallen into my shoe during travel. I can explain exactly how it got there if you'd like. I'm happy to cooperate fully with any additional screening you feel is necessary." But Morrison wasn't listening to explanations or offers of cooperation. His training had kicked in, the kind of training that sees threats in brown skin and weapons in spare change, that transforms routine security screening into combat scenarios. His hand moved to his service pistol, and the moment fractured into chaos that seemed to happen in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. "He's reaching for something," Morrison screamed, though security footage would later show that Xavier's hands never moved from their raised position. Potential weapon deployment, all units respond. 3 shots. Sharp, deafening cracks that silenced every conversation in Terminal B and sent travelers diving for cover behind check-in counters and baggage carousels. Xavier crumpled to the polished floor, blood spreading beneath his gray hoodie like spilled wine, dark and terrible against the white tiles. He didn't scream, didn't fight back, didn't even look surprised. Just fell with the resigned grace of someone who'd always known this moment might come. But here's what made this different from every other case of police violence you've heard, about what transformed a routine example of racial profiling into something unprecedented in American civil rights history. As chaos erupted, passengers screaming, children crying, officials scrambling for damage control, paramedics rushing in with their life-saving equipment, Xavier remained conscious and alert. And the first words out of his mouth, spoken clearly enough for Elena's recording device to capture, weren't curses or cries for help or demands for justice. He said, "Please call me Mr. X, and activate Greyhawk protocol immediately." Elena Rodriguez, still recording despite the pandemonium around her, caught every word. And in that moment I realized we weren't witnessing a random act of violence, another tragic example of bias in law enforcement. We were watching the first carefully orchestrated move in a chess game that had been planned for months, possibly years, by someone who understood the system well enough to use its own violence against itself. The ambulance was loading Xavier onto a stretcher, paramedics working frantically to stabilize his condition, when the impossible happened right before our disbelieving eyes. As medical personnel pressed gauze against his wounds and started IV lines, Xavier calmly spoke into his phone despite their urgent protests about staying still and conserving energy. His voice was steady, businesslike, as if being shot was merely an inconvenience interrupting important work. "Phase 1 is now active," he said quietly into the device, his words barely audible over the chaos but crystal clear in their purpose. "Terminal B security transfer is effective immediately. Initiate the corporate structure we discussed. Yes, I understand the legal implications. Execute the plan exactly as we rehearsed." That's when the airport's LED displays flickered and changed in a coordinated shift that sent chills down my spine. Instead of the usual flight information and gate announcements, they showed a single message that made airport officials panic. Emergency security protocol activated. All Terminal B personnel report to Gate 9. Immediately. New management briefing scheduled for 2:00 p.m. Compliance is mandatory. Airport officials panicked with the special terror of bureaucrats who've lost control of their own systems. How do you transfer management of an entire airport terminal? Who has the legal authority to override federal security protocols? How can a man bleeding on a stretcher somehow command their electronic systems? The answers came faster than anyone expected, delivered with the precision of a military operation. Tyler Nash, an independent journalist I recognized from his Twitter coverage of civil rights issues, approached Elena Rodriguez during the chaos of evacuation procedures and evidence collection. Without hesitation, she handed him a small flash drive, the complete recording she'd made of Morrison's escalation and the shooting. Within minutes, the video was uploaded to multiple platforms with a caption that would break the internet and change public discourse: unarmed black man shot over quarter in shoe. Security camera footage shows everything. Watch what happens next. The footage was devastating in its crystal clarity, impossible to spin or misinterpret. Morrison's obvious racial profiling from the moment Xavier entered his line of sight. Xavier's complete compliance with every instruction. The absurdity of 3 gunshots over loose change. The theatrical nature of Morrison's alleged fear. But more importantly, the video captured Xavier's mysterious final words and the strange calm with which he delivered them, as if he'd been expecting this exact scenario. Social media exploded within hours. Quartergate began trending worldwide. Civil rights organizations shared the video millions of times. Legal experts appeared on news programs to explain how this level of force could never be justified. The Denver Police Department found themselves defending the indefensible, while airport officials scrambled to understand how their security contractor had been replaced without their knowledge. From his hospital bed connected to monitors and IV drips, but fully alert, Xavier held an impromptu press conference that left veteran reporters speechless. Camera crews from every major network crammed into the small room, their equipment creating a forest of lights and microphones around his bed. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd been preparing for this moment his entire adult life. "My name is Xavier Blake," he announced, looking directly into the CNN camera. "I'm the founder and CEO of Meridian Security Solutions, and as of this morning, I own the complete security services contract for Terminal B at Denver International Airport. What you witnessed today was not random violence. It was the predictable result of systematic bias that I've been documenting and preparing to address for over 2 years." The room erupted with questions, shouted over each other in the familiar chaos of breaking news. How do you buy airport security from a hospital bed? How do you plan for something like this? How long have you been planning this operation? Xavier's smile was enigmatic, carrying decades of preparation and the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. 3 months ago, through my subsidiary company Phantom Defense LLC, I acquired the private security contract for Terminal B through a completely legitimate competitive bidding process. The contract included a unique emergency clause that I insisted upon during negotiations. If current security personnel engage in criminal conduct resulting in injury to civilians, management authority transfers immediately to Phantom Defense with full operational control. His attorney, Crystal Yamamoto, stepped forward with thick folders of documentation that represented months of legal preparation. Purchase agreements, insurance bonds, federal security clearances, personnel records, training certifications, everything legal, everything pre-planned, everything designed to survive the inevitable legal challenges. Xavier hadn't reacted to being shot. He'd engineered the entire scenario. You see, Xavier continued, his voice gaining strength despite his injuries. I've been studying this system methodically for 2 years. Tracking complaint patterns, identifying problem officers, documenting systematic bias and security protocols. Officer Morrison has 17 formal complaints in his personnel file for excessive force against minorities, complaints that were buried by his supervisors and union representatives. Today's shooting was statistically inevitable. I just made sure I'd be in legal position to do something meaningful about it when it happened. The revelation was staggering in its implications. This wasn't random violence or even conscious martyrdom. It was strategic sacrifice, a calculated decision to absorb the system's violence in order to gain the power to reform it. Xavier had deliberately put himself in Morrison's path, knowing the likely outcome because he had the resources and legal framework to transform that violence into systematic change. The questions came faster. Wasn't this entrapment? Hadn't he manipulated the situation? How could he justify putting himself at risk? Xavier's answers revealed the depth of his preparation and the breadth of his vision for reform. Entrapment requires government agents inducing someone to commit crimes they wouldn't normally commit, he explained patiently. I simply existed as a black man in an airport security line. Officer Morrison's decision to shoot me was entirely his own based on his own biases and training. I didn't make him racist, I just gave him an opportunity to demonstrate his racism while cameras were recording. But the real shock came when Xavier announced his next move, the reason behind months of careful planning and enormous personal risk. Tomorrow morning at Gate 9, the exact spot where I bled on the floor, we're implementing the Guardian security system. No more profiling based on appearance, religion, or national origin. No more escalation based on fear and prejudice. We're going to demonstrate to America what airport security looks like when it's designed to protect everyone equally while actually improving public safety. The hospital room fell silent as the implications sank in. Morrison had pulled the trigger on his own career and didn't even know it yet. More importantly, he'd triggered a carefully constructed legal mechanism that would transform airport security across the country. Gate 9 the next morning resembled a courtroom more than an airport terminal, with Xavier presiding as both judge and reformed system architect. Despite his injuries, he stood exactly where his blood had stained the polished floor 18 hours earlier. His left arm in a professional sling, but his presence commanding every eye in the terminal. Every Terminal B employee had been summoned by automated messages, and the tension was thick enough to cut with security scissors. Morrison arrived looking defiant and confident, probably expecting his police union to handle whatever legal theater this represented through familiar channels of bureaucratic protection. That confidence evaporated like morning mist when Xavier's security director, a stern former military officer named Captain Sarah Webb, approached him with federal marshals and a termination notice printed on official letterhead. Officer Brett Morrison Xavier announced to the assembled crowd of employees, passengers, and media representatives, "You are hereby terminated for excessive force violation of de-escalation protocols, criminal assault on an unarmed civilian, and systematic violation of civil rights. Your security clearance is permanently revoked, your weapon confiscated, and your pension subject to federal review, pending investigation of your entire career pattern." The symbolism was intentional and devastatingly powerful. Morrison being stripped of authority in the exact spot where he'd abused it, in front of every colleague who'd witnessed his years-long pattern of harassment and discrimination. Several younger employees started crying, not from sadness, but from relief that someone finally had the power and courage to hold Morrison accountable for behavior everyone knew was wrong, but no one could stop. Security footage from the past year, displayed on the large monitors throughout the gate area, showed Morrison's pattern of discriminatory treatment with damning clarity. Young black men subjected to extended searches, while elderly white women passed through without question. Families with Muslim names pulled aside for additional screening, while similar families with European names proceeded normally. A statistical analysis prepared by Meridian's research team showed that Morrison flagged minority travelers for additional screening at rates 340% higher than his colleagues. But Xavier wasn't finished delivering justice. He called Elena Rodriguez forward, and I watched this young woman who'd had the courage to document truth when it would have been safer and easier to look away. Her hands shook slightly as she approached, probably expecting punishment for recording security procedures without permission. Elena Rodriguez showed more integrity in 30 seconds than some people show in entire careers, Xavier said, his voice carrying across the silent terminal. She recorded the truth when it would have been safer to remain silent. She chose justice over job security, transparency over complicity. She's being immediately promoted to Director of Passenger Relations for all Meridian operations, and her first responsibility will be training every security officer in this terminal on de-escalation techniques and bias recognition. The applause was thunderous, echoing off the terminal's high ceilings like artillery fire. Here was someone who'd stood up for justice being rewarded instead of punished, promoted instead of terminated. In a world where whistleblowers usually face retaliation and career destruction, seeing Elena elevated to leadership was nothing short of revolutionary. The promotion came with substantial authority and resources. Elena would oversee passenger complaint resolution, conduct regular bias training sessions, and maintain direct reporting authority to Xavier himself. Her recording equipment would be upgraded to professional standards, and she'd lead a team of passenger advocates stationed throughout the airport to document and address discrimination in real time. Then Xavier unveiled the technological heart of his revolution, the Guardian security system, his answer to Morrison's brand of security theater and systematic bias. Instead of profiling based on race, religion, appearance, or national origin, the system used advanced behavioral analysis developed by former FBI profilers and Israeli security experts. Micro-expressions indicating deception, stress indicators suggesting hostile intent, movement patterns consistent with concealment, actual security threats, rather than demographic characteristics. Security isn't about fear, Xavier explained, as screens around Gate 9 displayed the new protocols in multiple languages. It's about protection based on scientific evidence rather than cultural prejudice. We're going to protect travelers from real threats, not from officers who see threats that exist only in their own biases and inadequate training. The demonstration was immediately impressive and convinced even skeptical observers. The Guardian system flagged a nervous-acting passenger not because of his Middle Eastern appearance, but because his eye movements, body language, and stress indicators suggested deception. A respectful secondary search revealed he was carrying falsified documentation. The system worked perfectly, and it worked without any consideration of the traveler's ethnicity or religion. Another demonstration showed the system's bias-free operation when it cleared a group of young black men traveling together, exactly the demographic that would have triggered Morrison's suspicions because their behavior patterns indicated normal travel stress rather than hostile intent. The contrast with previous procedures was stark and undeniable. Xavier announced that the pilot program would run for 6 months, with independent auditors monitoring every interaction through multiple oversight mechanisms. Complaint resolution would be live-streamed for complete transparency. Community oversight boards would review policies monthly. Civil rights organizations would have real-time access to screening statistics. Everything Morrison's regime had hidden behind security classifications would now be visible to public scrutiny. I watched Morrison's former colleagues, the ones who'd stayed silent while he terrorized passengers for years, slowly begin to nod with something approaching relief. They'd seen the old system fail spectacularly and publicly yesterday. Now they were seeing what accountability looked like, what professional security work could become when freed from bias and fear. Within 3 weeks, Guardian Security was making international headlines and attracting attention from security experts worldwide. The technology was genuinely revolutionary artificial intelligence systems that could detect actual security concerns while remaining completely blind to demographic characteristics that had nothing to do with threat assessment. But what really grabbed global attention were the operational results that seemed almost too good to be true. Security throughput increased 31% as officers stopped wasting time on bias-driven searches that targeted innocent travelers. Passenger complaints dropped to statistically 0 for the first time in the airport's recorded history. Average wait times decreased by an average of 12 minutes during peak travel periods. Customer satisfaction scores reached levels previously thought impossible. And most significantly, the secondary screening rate became statistically equal across all demographic groups for the first time since the creation of modern airport security protocols. Major news networks descended on Denver International like journalists covering a war zone. 60 Minutes requested an exclusive feature story. CNN International broadcast live from Terminal B for an entire week. Airport authorities from Los Angeles to Miami, from London to Dubai, started making discreet inquiries about implementing similar systems. The stock price of Meridian Security Solutions doubled, then tripled, then quintupled, as investors recognized the massive global market for bias-free security technology. But Xavier wasn't interested in building a traditional business empire or maximizing shareholder profits. During a press conference that crashed news websites worldwide, he announced that Meridian would license Guardian security technology to any airport in America completely free of charge, with one absolutely non-negotiable condition. They had to implement the complete accountability structure, including civilian oversight, transparent complaint resolution, mandatory bias training for all personnel, and real-time statistical monitoring of screening demographics. This isn't about building a monopoly or creating shareholder value, he told CNN's Anderson Cooper in an interview that generated 40 million views in its first week. This is about proving that security and civil rights aren't opposing forces requiring difficult compromises. They're complementary systems that strengthen each other. When people feel respected and protected rather than suspected and harassed, everyone is safer, screening is more effective, and actual threats are more easily identified. The response was immediate, passionate, and deeply polarizing across traditional political lines. Progressive organizations hailed it as the most significant civil rights advancement since the Voting Rights Act, proof that technology could eliminate rather than amplify human bias. Conservative critics worried about privatizing national security and dangerous precedents of emotional decision-making, overruling established security protocols. Airport employees' unions split completely down generational lines, younger members enthusiastically embracing the changes, older members resisting what they saw as criticism of their professional competence. The breakthrough that changed everything came when major insurance companies started offering significant premium reductions to airports implementing Guardian security protocols. Lower lawsuit exposure from discrimination complaints, reduced worker compensation claims from stressed employees, improved customer satisfaction scores, leading to increased revenue. The business case became undeniable even for the most resistant airport administrators and government officials. Lloyd's of London published a detailed actuarial analysis showing that bias-free security systems reduced legal liability by an average of 67%, while improving actual threat detection by 34%. Insurance premiums for airports using Guardian technology dropped by an average of 22% in the first year, creating immediate budget savings that more than offset implementation costs. Then came the letter that changed everything and elevated Xavier's revolution from local innovation to potential national policy. The chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Congressman David Patterson, requested Xavier's formal testimony about innovations in civilian security technology and their potential applications for national transportation infrastructure protection. Everyone understood what this really meant. Congress wanted to evaluate whether Guardian security could replace TSA protocols nationwide. Xavier was being invited to pitch his system to the most powerful transportation oversight body in America, with the potential to transform airport security for every traveler in the country. The hearing was scheduled for 5 weeks later, giving Xavier just enough time to prepare the most important presentation of his life. He had 5 weeks to convince Congress that a black man who'd been shot by airport security could revolutionize airport security for everyone, that his pain could become everyone's protection. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond legal capacity, with fire marshals allowing standing room only because of the extraordinary public interest in the proceedings. I managed to secure a gallery seat by arriving before dawn, and the energy was electric with anticipation that reminded me of Supreme Court arguments on landmark civil rights cases. Congressman Patterson called the hearing to order with unusual gravity, acknowledging that they were discussing fundamental questions about security, civil rights, and American values in the 21st century. Xavier entered the room with quiet confidence that commanded immediate attention, his left arm still showing visible signs of his injury, but his bearing absolutely regal. Behind him sat Crystal Yamamoto and Marcus King, a legendary civil rights attorney who'd been quietly building a comprehensive federal case against systematic bias in airport security protocols for over 3 years. The legal team represented decades of civil rights experience and an intimate understanding of both constitutional law and security policy. Congressman Robert Hayes from Texas immediately launched into an aggressive attack, attempting to paint Xavier as a radical activist seeking to undermine national security for personal profit and political gain. Mr. Blake, isn't it remarkably convenient that you happen to have cameras recording when you were allegedly mistreated? Isn't it highly suspicious that you had comprehensive legal documents prepared to take over airport security operations? How do we know this wasn't an elaborate setup designed to create a crisis that you could then exploit for financial and political benefit? Xavier's response was devastating in its calm, precision, and factual foundation. Congressman Hayes, Are you seriously suggesting that I arranged to be shot 3 times in the chest in order to win a business contract? That I deliberately risked my life, suffered permanent nerve damage, and endured months of physical therapy as an elaborate marketing strategy? If so, I'd like to point out that there are significantly easier and less dangerous ways to demonstrate the effectiveness of security technology than nearly dying for it. The room erupted in nervous laughter, but Xavier wasn't finished dismantling the congressman's attack. He nodded to Marcus King, who began presenting documented evidence of systematic bias that made my blood run cold and silenced every critic in the room. The system that shot Mr. Blake, Marcus testified in a voice that carried absolute authority, has a documented 96% false positive rate for secondary screenings of black male travelers aged 20 to 50. The same system has a 12% false positive rate for white male travelers in the same age range. That's not security, that's statistical harassment disguised as public safety, systematic discrimination codified into federal policy. The smoking gun that destroyed all opposition was TSA Internal Directive 4:17, which Marcus read aloud in a voice that carried across the silent chamber like thunder. Personnel should maintain elevated vigilance when screening male travelers of apparent Middle Eastern or African descent, particularly those displaying unusual confidence, verbal facility, or resistance to secondary screening procedures. Such characteristics may indicate sophisticated training or hostile intent. The implications hit the room like a physical blow that left several congressmen visibly shaken. Unusual confidence, meaning a black man who didn't act sufficiently deferential, could be flagged as suspicious. Verbal facility, meaning articulate, educated responses were somehow threatening rather than reassuring. Resistance to secondary screening, meaning questioning discriminatory treatment, was itself evidence of criminal intent rather than legitimate civil rights concerns. Xavier let the horrified silence stretch for nearly 30 seconds before delivering his knockout punch with surgical precision. That directive, Congressman Hayes, is exactly why Officer Morrison shot me. He wasn't acting as a rogue agent or making independent decisions. He was following official federal protocol to the letter. The protocol was the problem, not the individual officer. Congressman Patterson, visibly shaken by the revelations, asked the question everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. Mr. Blake, what you're describing sounds like institutional racism codified into federal security policy and implemented with taxpayer funding. If that's accurate, how do we fix something? This systemic Xavier's answer was simple, elegant, and revolutionary. We replace it with something better, something that actually works. The committee's decision was unanimous and historic: implement Guardian security in 25 major airports immediately with full federal funding, congressional oversight, and independent monitoring. But the real validation of Xavier's approach came from the most unexpected source during the final vote. Officer Morrison, who'd been conspicuously absent from public view since his termination and the subsequent federal investigation, requested permission to address the committee. Security was heightened because nobody knew what to expect, but what happened next surprised everyone in that packed hearing room and watching on television worldwide. I want to apologize to Mr. Blake and to every traveler I mistreated during my 15-year career in airport security, Morrison said, his voice breaking with genuine emotion that couldn't be faked. I was systematically trained to see threats where none existed. I was professionally rewarded for being suspicious of people based solely on their appearance. The system taught me to be afraid of diversity, and that institutionalized fear made me dangerous to innocent people who deserved protection, not persecution. The hearing room was absolutely silent, except for the quiet sound of photographers capturing this unprecedented moment. This wasn't legal strategy or damage control choreographed by attorneys. This was genuine remorse from someone who'd finally understood the systemic nature of the harm he'd caused. Morrison continued with increasing strength. Guardian security works because it's based on actual behavioral indicators rather than racial bias. In the 6 months since implementation at Terminal B, the system has identified 12 actual security threats, people I never would have noticed or investigated because they looked like me. Meanwhile, harassment complaints have dropped to 0. Passenger satisfaction scores are the highest in the airport's history, and actual security has improved dramatically. Xavier, sitting at the witness table, watched Morrison's testimony with an expression that combined forgiveness with unwavering accountability. When reporters asked him about it later, his response was measured but profound. Accountability isn't about punishment or revenge, it's about learning and systematic change. Officer Morrison's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and help train others shows more genuine courage than his original actions showed fear. The committee's final recommendation was stronger and more comprehensive than anyone expected. Guardian security should be implemented nationwide within 18 months, with full federal funding for training, oversight, and technological infrastructure. But they went significantly further, recommending that TSA Directive 4.17 and similar policies be not just revised, but completely eliminated from all federal security protocols and replaced with bias-free behavioral analysis standards. The vote wasn't close. Even the most conservative members couldn't argue with results that showed improved security, eliminated complaints, increased efficiency, reduced costs, and complete elimination of racial disparities in screening procedures. But Xavier wasn't satisfied with policy changes alone, understanding that lasting reform required cultural transformation. During the post-hearing press conference, he announced the Guardian Foundation, a comprehensive nonprofit organization dedicated to retraining airport security personnel nationwide and developing bias-free security protocols for other law enforcement applications. The foundation would be funded entirely by Meridian's Guardian security profits, ensuring sustainable long-term reform independent of political changes or budget pressures. Most surprisingly, Morrison would be a central part of the training team, his transformation from perpetrator to educator becoming a model for systematic reform. The most effective teacher of bias recognition, Xavier explained to skeptical reporters, is someone who's lived with bias and learned to recognize it in themselves. Officer Morrison's journey from perpetrator to educator proves that people can change when given proper support, honest feedback, and systematic accountability. Standing in Terminal B, exactly 18 months after the shooting, watching families of every background move through security without fear, harassment, or discrimination, I reflected on how completely and permanently everything had changed. The memorial Xavier commissioned wasn't a traditional statue or commemorative plaque. It was a living digital display showing real-time transparency data that proved systematic reform was possible. Screening times, complaint resolution, statistics, demographic, equality metrics, threat detection rates, passenger satisfaction scores, everything visible to anyone who cared to look, updated every hour, audited independently every month. The numbers told an incredible story of transformation bias. Eliminated security, improved efficiency, increased satisfaction, maximized. Elena Rodriguez, now managing passenger relations for 18 airports across 6 states, had become a nationally recognized advocate for transparency in travel security. Her TED Talk on the power of witnessing truth had been viewed 23 million times. She'd testified before Congress, spoken at international security conferences, and inspired a new generation of civil rights advocates. Her promotion from line TSA agent to national civil rights leader proved that courage could be rewarded rather than punished. Morrison was teaching bias recognition workshops to security personnel in 42 states, his transformation from perpetrator to educator inspiring similar conversions across the industry. His testimony about systematic bias had become required viewing in police academies nationwide. He'd published a book about unlearning racism that became a bestseller and donated all proceeds to civil rights organizations. Tyler Nash had won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of systematic discrimination in airport security, his initial article spawning a year-long investigation that exposed similar problems in transportation systems worldwide. Crystal Yamamoto had been confirmed as a federal judge. Marcus King was arguing a Supreme Court case on algorithmic bias in law enforcement that could transform policing nationwide. But the most powerful moment in my year and a half of following this story came when I saw Xavier helping a young black boy who'd gotten separated from his family in the security line. The child was crying, overwhelmed by the chaos, and frightened by the uniforms that represented authority and potential danger. Xavier knelt to the boy's eye level and spoke quietly until the tears stopped and the child smiled with genuine trust. Later, I asked Xavier what he'd told the boy that had such a transformative effect. I told him he belonged here, Xavier said simply, that this place was as much his as anyone else's, that he never had to apologize for existing in public spaces, and that the people in uniforms were there to help him, not hurt him, that he could travel anywhere in the world with confidence and dignity. That's when I fully understood the real revolution Xavier had started through his strategic sacrifice and systematic reform. It wasn't just about better security technology or reformed federal policies. It was about dignity, respect, and the radical idea that every person deserves to move through the world without having to prove they belong or justify their existence. The system that had shot an innocent man for carrying a quarter now protected everyone equally while improving actual security. The officer who'd pulled the trigger was now teaching others to recognize and overcome their biases. The young TSA agent who'd had the courage to record the truth was now empowered to prevent future injustices on a national scale. The attorney who documented systematic bias was now writing new laws to prevent it permanently. Xavier Blake hadn't just survived being shot, he'd transformed that violence into protective change for millions of travelers worldwide. He'd proven that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger, revenge, or even protest, but the patient, systematic construction of better systems that serve everyone equally. Guardian security had been implemented in over 200 airports worldwide. Bias-related complaints had dropped 97%. Actual threat detection had improved 43%. Customer satisfaction had reached unprecedented levels. Insurance costs had decreased substantially. The business case for equality had been proven conclusively. Looking at the real-time data wall that had replaced a traditional memorial, watching statistical proof that bias-free security was not only possible but more effective than discriminatory systems, I realized that what happened at Gate 9 could have been just another tragic example of racial profiling gone wrong, another hashtag that trends for a week and disappears. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most significant civil rights advancement in transportation security since the end of legal segregation, proof that individual courage combined with systematic planning could transform entire industries. Because one man refused to let his pain be meaningless, refused to let the system that hurt him continue hurting others, and had the resources, patience, legal knowledge, and strategic brilliance to turn a moment of violence into a generation of protection for everyone. So I'll ask you what I ask myself every day. When you witness injustice, do you look away and hope someone else will fix it, or do you find a way to change the system that created the injustice? Because sometimes justice isn't about getting even or making people pay, it's about making sure no one else has to go through what you went through. What do you think? Did Xavier go too far by deliberately putting himself in danger to expose systematic bias? Should he have found another way, or should he have acted sooner to prevent other victims? Drop a comment if you've ever experienced discriminatory treatment while traveling, and let me know what state you're watching from so we can see how far this story reaches. And smash that subscribe button for Black Stories box, because every story of justice deserves to be heard, every example of systematic change needs to be shared, and every victory against bias makes the next victory more possible.